Harold and Jane. We moved into the neighborhood a few years ago, right after my wife, Emma, and I got married. Our street was quiet, lined with big leafy trees and neat suburban homes. Across the street from us lived Harold and Jane, an older couple in their late 60s. They were kind and welcoming, always giving us a wave when we passed by. They had 2 sons in their 20s who came home every year for Thanksgiving with their families. It was clear that Harold and Jane went all out for the holiday. Every year, their house was filled with laughter and the smell of roasting turkey. I didn't get to know either of them very well, but they were always friendly. Jane had a warmth about her, and Harold, though quiet, always had a smile and a quick word when I'd see him outside. He loved working in his yard and kept it immaculate. Then last year, everything changed. Jane passed away unexpectedly in the spring. At first, Harold's sons and their families were always there. But after a month or so, they started coming by less and less. By the time summer faded into fall, Harold was spending most of his days alone. I'd see him out in the yard, like he was trying to keep up the appearance of normalcy, but there was something sad about it, something empty. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I stopped to talk to him while he was out front raking. I mentioned that Thanksgiving was coming up, and he looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Are your sons coming in for the holiday?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He paused, then shook his head. "No, I think it's going to be just me and Jane this year." I didn't understand what he meant, but I figured he was just feeling sentimental, grieving her loss in his own way. Emma and I, feeling bad for him, invited him over. He seemed reluctant, but eventually agreed. Thanksgiving Day came. My parents came, and so did Emma's, but Harold never showed. Emma and I kept looking across the street, but his house was dark, not a single light on, no signs of life. We distracted ourselves with dinner, the house filled with laughter and the usual holiday chaos, but Harold stayed at the edge of my thoughts. I glanced over at his house again and again, but still saw nothing. After dinner, I was watching the football game with my dad and father-in-law when Emma came up to me. "You should bring Harold a plate," she said. "He's probably really lonely." I sighed. I didn't really want to, but it felt like the right thing to do. So I grabbed a plate, walked across the street, and knocked on Harold's door. There was no answer. I rang the bell. Still nothing. With a heavy sigh, I noticed the door was cracked open, just a bit. I pushed it, and it swung open. I'd never been inside his house before, but I always imagined it would smell like cinnamon and autumn, like the holidays. Instead, it was cold and eerily quiet. I stepped in, unsure whether I should be there. The house was immaculately clean, everything in its place, just like Harold's yard. The furniture was older, but well kept, and there was a strange stillness in the air. I walked around the downstairs, calling out for Harold. No answer. I didn't want to go upstairs. He could be sleeping or something, but still I felt like something was wrong. Then I noticed a sound, a low rumbling noise, distant at first, but growing louder as I walked toward the back of the house. I moved through the kitchen slowly and set the plate down on the table. The noise was coming from the garage. I crept toward the door, the rumbling sound now almost deafening. I opened the door. Harold's car was running. It took me a moment to process. The engine hummed in the closed garage. I looked closer and saw him slumped over in the driver's seat, his face pale and motionless. I rushed to the car, panic rising in my gut. I opened the door. His body was unnaturally still. At first, it looked as though he might be sleeping, but there was no breath, no rise and fall of his chest. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. I dialed 911, my hands shaking, but I knew deep down it was too late. How long had he been out there? Hours? The whole day? I couldn't stop the guilt that gnawed at me. He had said he was going to spend the day with Jane. I guess I didn't realize he meant it literally. Giving and taking. I had moved across the country for a new job, and, with the holiday season approaching, I found myself far from home, alone. My family wasn't close by, and I wasn't in the mood to drown in loneliness over turkey and football, so I decided to give back and volunteered at a local homeless shelter, hoping to make a difference in someone's day, and maybe in mine too. The kitchen was bustling when I arrived, the smell of roasting turkey mingling with the clatter of dishes. I was assigned to wash up. It wasn't long before I met Maggie. She was about my age, with dark hair pulled back into a messy ponytail and a smile that made her seem approachable, despite the heavy atmosphere at the shelter. We worked side by side, scrubbing pots and pans, and in the quiet moments between the chatter of the kitchen staff and volunteers, we got to know each other. She told me she'd grown up in the area, but had moved away for several years, only to recently return. She had volunteered at the shelter several times before, but this was her first Thanksgiving. The day was both uplifting and sobering. There was a feeling of camaraderie, of people coming together for a good cause. But there was also a sense of deep sadness as I thought about the faces I saw, men, women, children, sitting down for a meal, thankful for one day of comfort, but struggling for every other day of the year. I couldn't help but think about tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. For these people, it wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was about surviving. After several hours, we were told to take a break. Maggie and I sat down at a table with a man named Samuel. He was older than us, probably in his 40s, with a face worn by the years of hard living. He was gruff, but polite, and we chatted as we ate. "I've been living on the streets for more than 10 years, Samuel said between bites, his voice low. "Most nights I sleep under a bridge by the freeway. It's not perfect, but it's safe enough. There's a little homeless camp there. As safe as you can get out here, I guess." There was a weariness in his voice. "Can I ask how you ended up living on the street?" I asked, unsure if such a question was out of bounds. "It was drugs," Samuel said simply, his tone flat. "I liked drugs more than I liked going to work. I liked them more than just about anything else, I guess." His eyes lowered, his words carrying a quiet resignation. He didn't seem angry, just tired. Maggie, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "My brother's an addict," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "He lived on the streets in Portland for 2 years before we could get through to him. But now he's clean, has his own apartment and a job. He's doing great right now. Almost 4 years clean." Samuel looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Maybe someday that'll be me," he said. "But not today, and probably not tomorrow." There was no bitterness in his voice, just an acceptance, a kind of quiet understanding that some things in life can't be fixed in a day. We continued eating, and the conversation lulled into a comfortable silence, for a few minutes at least. Then a man, disheveled and frantic, stormed through the door, eyes wild. He looked around for a moment, and then headed straight for our table. "Hey!" he shouted, pointing a finger at Samuel. "You took my stuff!" Samuel looked up slowly, his face calm, but there was a flicker of confusion. "I didn't take none of your stuff," he said quietly, his hand still resting on the edge of the table. The man was barely listening. "Yeah, you did. You took my bag. It had all my stuff in it. You were next to me last night, and when I woke up, it was gone." Samuel, still calm, shook his head. "There was a lot of people there last night. I didn't take anything, man." A security guard started walking over. "Is there a problem here?" he asked as he approached. Before the guard was close enough to stop him, the man pulled a knife from his coat pocket. It happened so fast. In one fluid motion, he lunged at Samuel and plunged the blade into his neck. Blood sprayed out in a sudden, sickening burst. The sound of it hitting the table was like a slap in the face. Time seemed to slow, but my body refused to move. Maggie screamed. The others at the table jumped back in shock, their faces pale. The security guard tackled the man to the floor, and a second guard rushed over to help. But by then it was too late. Maggie was already at Samuel's side, pressing napkins against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. I joined her, handing her more napkins, but I knew, we all knew, it wasn't going to be enough. About 10 minutes later, police and EMTs arrived, but when they checked Samuel's pulse, they gave us the look, the one that said it was over. Samuel's eyes were open, still wide in fear, but his body was lifeless. He never had a chance. We sat there, stunned, the silence in the room more deafening than any of the screams. I kept thinking, he was just here, just a moment ago, talking about hope, and now he was gone. Samuel would never get his second chance. He would never again have something to be thankful for. The uninvited guest. My dad met Carly when I was 9. My mom had been gone for nearly 6 years by then, and while it was kind of awkward to think about my dad dating, Carly had a son my age, Charlie, and we got along great. After a year, Dad and Carly were engaged, and less than a year after that, they were married. Carly never asked me to call her mom, even though she acted like one. but I never had a problem introducing Charlie as my brother. Charlie never talked about his dad. I just assumed he had died like my mom, so I didn't bring it up. Then came Thanksgiving when I was 12 and Charlie was 11. Dad and Carly were hosting my grandparents, my Uncle Bobby, Aunt Molly, and my cousin Jake. Nobody on Carly's side came because they all lived really far away. We were just finishing dinner when I noticed Carly look down on her phone like she was reading a text. I remember thinking that she looked sick, like literally sick, like she was gonna throw up. She showed my dad her phone, and he just looked pissed. Over the next few minutes, they kept looking at her phone again and again, like lots of messages were coming in. And then all the grown-ups were talking. I was just about to ask what was going on when my grandma clapped her hands together, turned to me and Charlie, and said, "Let's go watch a movie in the basement while we have our dessert." Jake, who was 15, so me and Charlie looked up to him, said yes right away, so me and Charlie were immediately on board. We loved our movie nights with Grandma anyway. So the four of us went down to the basement to watch Home Alone. At some point during the movie, I remember seeing flashing lights outside through the window, like from a cop car or maybe an ambulance. I mentioned it, and Grandma said that someone across the street was sick. I didn't question at the time how she even knew that. I just kept watching Home Alone and fell asleep on the pull-out couch. And that was that, until last year. We spent Thanksgiving in Florida, and the morning after, I went golfing with Uncle Bobby and Jake. It had been 9 years since that Thanksgiving. I'm not sure what made me think of it on the course, but I mentioned the Thanksgiving that we did a movie night with Grandma in the basement, and I wondered who on the block had needed an ambulance. Uncle Bobby and Jake looked at each other. "What?" I asked. I'm not sure I should be telling you this," Uncle Bobby said, "but I mean, you're an adult now." And that's when he told me what really happened. You see, Charlie's dad didn't die when he was little. He had been in prison. He ended up in prison because he used to hit Carly, like, a lot. And apparently he did more than just hit her. I'll just leave it at that. It got even worse when Charlie was born, with him threatening to kill them both. So she took baby Charlie and went to her parents' house. Charlie's dad tried to break in, then assaulted a cop when they were called. Apparently he had done some other stuff too, and ended up in prison. Carly used that opportunity to divorce him and move away. She met my dad, started a new life, and felt safe. Until that Thanksgiving. The reason she kept looking at her phone was because he was texting her, threatening her, saying he knew where she was and that he was coming. Carly was freaking out, having a full-blown panic attack. The safe life she thought she had was crumbling. About 30 minutes after Grandma took me, Charlie, and Jake downstairs to watch Home Alone, Carly's ex-husband showed up. Uncle Bobby said my dad marched right out into the yard to meet him. He said that Carly's ex-husband was a big guy, maybe 6'4" and 250 pounds. My dad, most certainly, is not. He's probably 5'9" and 165 pounds. I was actually taller than him by 8th grade. So the ex-husband probably thought my dad wasn't any kind of threat. But he didn't know that Dad was a former Army Ranger, and that instead of golf, he spent his weekends boxing and teaching judo. So Uncle Bobby said that my dad confronted the guy in the yard. They stood face to face for a few moments. Uncle Bobby said he could tell they were talking to each other, but he couldn't hear them. Then the ex-husband threw a punch, and my dad beat the holy hell out of him. He said Dad landed about 6 punches before Carly's ex-husband even landed one. He knocked him down, mounted him like an MMA fighter, and smashed him with elbows until Uncle Bobby pulled him off. Uncle Bobby said he was worried my dad was going to kill the guy. When the cops showed up, one of them was a friend of Dad's from the boxing gym. That, plus the fact that the ex-husband was not only violating a restraining order, but also violating the terms of his parole by crossing state lines to do so, and my dad never even faced charges. The ex-husband was shipped back to prison across the country. Later that night, while we were all asleep downstairs, Uncle Bobby, my dad, and my grandpa were watching the football game and drinking a beer. My grandpa asked Dad if he was okay. Uncle Bobby said my dad smiled the biggest, brightest smile he had ever seen. "Never better," he said. The argument. It started off like any other Thanksgiving. The house smelled like turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. My mom, as usual, had gone all out with the meal. There was chatter and laughter, the usual family banter. I was home from college for the week, and my little brother, Tommy, was being really sweet, excited to see me. Even our cousin Alex, who I hadn't seen in months, was there. Everything was fine, until the wine started flowing, and the topic turned to politics. If you've been around a family during a holiday dinner, you know how quickly things can go from jovial to tense. But this time, it wasn't just the usual disagreements over the latest news headlines. It got personal. Uncle Paul, my mom's older brother, had been sitting next to my dad at the head of the table, holding court as usual. He's a college professor, very intelligent, and loves reminding everyone of that fact. You know the type. He's the one who can't let a conversation go without dropping some obscure fact or citing some obscure study. My Aunt Lauren, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. She's a conspiracy theorist, deep down the rabbit hole. If you've read something on Facebook, Lauren believes it, no matter how outlandish. It started innocently enough. Uncle Paul made a joke about the latest political scandal, something about how the whole thing was ridiculous. Aunt Lauren, already red in the face, immediately jumped in with some theory she read about, and that's when the fun began. "I swear, Paul," she snapped, "you just don't get it. You can't believe everything the mainstream media tells you. You need to do your own research." "Lauren, you can't really believe that. I'm a college professor. I know how to research things properly," Paul retorted, his voice thick with condescension. "Maybe you should stop getting your information from Facebook and start reading real journals." The table fell silent for a moment, the tension rising. I glanced at my mom, who was nervously chewing on her turkey. She could already tell where this was going. "Real journals?" Lauren spat, clearly offended. "Is that what you think? That you're smarter than me just because you read some article in a real journal? You think you know everything, Paul, but you're just as blind as everyone else." Uncle Paul laughed. "I'm not blind, Lauren. I've studied this for years. You're the one who's blind, letting people who have an agenda tell you what to think." Uncle Paul couldn't just make a point. He had to make sure everyone else felt stupid at the same time. Aunt Lauren was fuming. I could see her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her glass. Her breathing was getting shallow, and I could tell she was holding back a flood of angry words she couldn't quite get out. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you, Paul?" she said, her voice shaking. "You think because you have a fancy job and a degree that you're better than everyone else. But you have no idea what's really going on. You're just a sheep." She paused for a moment. "And an asshole." Uncle Paul just smirked, seeming happy that he had gotten her so worked up. "Oh, Lauren, give it a rest. You're just upset because your entire worldview was spoon-fed to you by Russian bots." That was when things took a turn. Lauren slammed her fist down at the table, making the dishes rattle. I jumped and the room went completely silent. Then, without warning, she lunged at Paul. She grabbed the wine bottle in front of her and swung it toward him. "Stop it, Lauren," Mom screamed, but it was too late. The bottle hit Paul in the shoulder and he staggered back, knocking his chair over in the process. It wasn't over, though. In a wild panic, Aunt Lauren scrambled over the table, pushing plates and food aside. Uncle Paul, who was much bigger than her, stood up quickly, shoving her away. But in the struggle, he tripped backward, and that's when he knocked into my cousin Alex, who had been standing behind the table near the counter. Alex didn't have a chance to react. Paul slammed into him, pinning him against the counter. Alex let out a gasp. "Sorry," Uncle Paul muttered, righting himself. He turned his attention back to Lauren, but before he could say anything, my mom screamed. Alex had turned around, his face pale and terror in his eyes. The carving knife was sticking out of his abdomen, a dark red stain growing on his shirt around the blade. He had been holding the knife when Paul slammed into him, and the collision forced the blade into his stomach, just beneath his ribs. Oh my God, screamed Aunt Gabby, rushing to her son. She reached for the handle of the knife. "Don't pull it out," Paul shouted. "It'll make him bleed more." My dad was already on the phone with 911. I was still in my seat, staring at Alex, tears in my eyes. Uncle Paul tried to put pressure on the wound, but with the blade still there, he wasn't sure what to do. Under other circumstances, Uncle Paul having no answers probably would have made everyone smile. Aunt Lauren had collapsed to the floor, sobbing. The EMTs arrived within minutes, clearing the kitchen to tend to Alex. The police followed before Alex had even been loaded into the ambulance. My parents, as the homeowners, were questioned first. They told the cops what happened. My dad, who frankly never much liked Uncle Paul or Aunt Lauren, pulled no punches, telling them exactly what happened. Aunt Lauren and Uncle Paul sat in silent shame. Aunt Lauren was arrested. Apparently swinging a wine bottle at Uncle Paul was enough to get charged with assault and battery, and the resulting injuries to Alex just confused the situation even more. The police told Uncle Paul he could go to the hospital with his son, but that they'd be stopping by with more questions. Alex was rushed into surgery, but all in all, he got lucky. The knife didn't puncture his intestines, but it did nick his spleen and cause significant internal bleeding. He spent a week in the hospital, but made a full recovery. In the end, based in part on a request from Alex himself, the charges against Aunt Lauren were dropped. Her and Uncle Paul had a tearful reconciliation where they apologized for 40 years worth of annoying each other, so I guess that was one thing to be thankful for. As Thanksgiving approached this year, my mom gave me a call. She told me we were starting a new tradition. My parents, me, and Tommy were going to Disney World. Nobody else was invited. The Turkey Bowl. Every Thanksgiving, my family has two traditions. The first is the Turkey Bowl, a massive, all-inclusive game of football before Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone plays. Men, women, kids, you name it. Even Grandma gets in for a couple of plays. The second tradition is a Secret Santa gift exchange, which we do after dinner. Since a lot of us are spread out across the country for Christmas, this way we still get to share gifts with everyone in person. Last year, the Turkey Bowl game was more intense than ever. My dad threw a last-second touchdown pass to my younger brother, tying up the game and forcing overtime for the first time in family history. Everyone was hyped, and I could feel the excitement in the air. We were about to flip a coin for possession in the overtime period when my grandmother, who's always been an early bird type, said she was heading back to the house. The turkey would need attention before dinner, and with the game being extended, we'd be later than we originally planned. The house was only a 2-minute walk up the hill, so it wasn't a big deal. But just as we were gearing up for the next play, we heard my grandmother's scream. It was short and blood-curdling, then total silence. We froze. My dad, uncle, and I looked at each other, our hearts in our throats. Without another word, we took off running up the hill. My brother wasn't far behind. When we reached the house, we burst through the front door to find my grandmother lying on the floor, trembling and crying. There, backing away from her, was a man in a black hoodie and a ski mask. In his hand was the carving knife for the turkey. For a split second, everything went quiet, like time itself was holding its breath. My dad rushed to my grandmother, trying to calm her down. I stood there frozen for a moment, but the man was already moving. He darted for the patio door, and my uncle, without a second thought, sprinted after him. "Joe, don't," my dad shouted, but it was too late. My uncle was already out the door. We helped Grandma up and sat her down at the kitchen table, making sure she was okay. She was shaking, but tough as ever. When she was settled, she told us what happened. She had walked back into the house to check on the turkey when she heard something strange in the family room. Thinking one of us had come back early, she walked toward it, but when she rounded the corner, she found the man in black trying to pull our TV off the wall. She screamed and ran for the kitchen, hoping to get to the back door, but he chased her. He grabbed her from behind and shoved her to the kitchen floor. Grandma said the man must have looked out the window and seen us coming up the hill, because that's when he grabbed the carving knife and started backing out of the kitchen. I guess he wasn't looking for a confrontation. A minute later, my uncle came back in, holding a large red bag. It was the bag with all the Secret Santa gifts that we had brought to exchange after dinner. "He dropped this as he was running," Uncle Joe said. The police arrived soon after. We gave them all the details we could, and my dad, being the practical one, said it had to be someone who knew our routine, someone who knew we'd be outside playing football, and that there would be gifts left inside. It didn't take the police long to track him down. It turned out the man was the young adult son of our neighbors, a family just a few houses down. The guy had a history of trouble, dating back to high school, and had been kicked out of college. His life had been a series of run-ins with the law. When they showed him the footage from our home security cameras, he cracked. But even as he confessed, he didn't take full responsibility. Instead, he tried to claim that we had more than him, that it was our fault for having better gifts and a better life. I honestly couldn't believe it, especially since his father was a well-known surgeon in town. His parents came over a few days later to apologize. Honestly, my family didn't hold it against them. They'd always been good neighbors, and it seemed like they were doing their best. Their two other kids were both in college, and had never been in trouble with the law, as far as we knew. We talked about skipping the turkey bowl this year, but my dad shot down that idea. We couldn't let some petty crook change our traditions, he said. My mom said she didn't think anyone would be able to concentrate on a game this year, worried about what might be going on back in the house. That's when Grandma piped in. She offered to stay behind while we played. Before my dad could object, she explained that she'd take a seat on the family room sofa with a shotgun across her lap. Friendsgiving. My senior year of college, my friends and I decided to host a Friendsgiving the weekend before Thanksgiving. It was supposed to be a simple gathering, just a small group of college friends, a bunch of homemade food, and some good conversation. But what started as a friendly get-together turned into a nightmare none of us will soon forget. It had been almost a year since we'd all seen Tim. He'd been part of our group for almost 2 years before the falling out, and we hadn't spoken to him much since then. He had been struggling in a class that our friend Kara had taken the semester before. She offered to help him study, and he managed to steal a paper off of her laptop. When he got busted for plagiarism, Kara got caught up in the mess. Tim eventually confessed and took a 0 in the class, and Kara was cleared. But he never actually apologized, so when he began to pull away from the group, we just let him go. We were all surprised when Kara, of all people, suggested we invite him to Friendsgiving. Since it would be our last one all together at school, she wanted to bury the hatchet. We were even more surprised when he accepted. I knew the tension would be awkward, and it was, at first. Tim arrived right on time, standing in the door holding a tray of corn pudding, like he wasn't sure if he should come in. There were a few nervous glances exchanged, but no one said anything. We awkwardly greeted him and ushered him inside. April, ever the hostess, took the tray from Tim, and I handed him a beer. Awkwardness hung in the air, but then Kara walked up to Tim and hugged him. He froze for a moment and then hugged her back. "I'm sorry," he said. And the next thing I knew, we were all hugging and the girls were crying, and we started toasting to friendship and second chances and generally acted way too melodramatic. The tension faded, and it started to feel like old times. We laughed over bad jokes and stupid memories. It wasn't perfect, but it almost felt like nothing had changed. Looking back, though, there were hints, subtle things that I missed. Tim had a way of making strange, offhand comments. Like when April talked about how excited she was that she got into law school, he looked away and muttered, "Must be nice." Or when we shared an inside joke from last month's Halloween party, he didn't laugh with us. Instead, he just said, "I might as well have dressed like the Invisible Man." But the real shift happened after dinner, when we all started to feel off. It began slowly. My stomach churned, then I felt lightheaded. I thought it was just the food settling, but then I saw the others looked just as bad. Lisa was sitting with her head in her hands, and Mark kept getting up, pacing back and forth, looking like he was going to pass out. I could hear people muttering, asking if anyone else felt dizzy or sick, and I wondered if maybe the turkey was undercooked. Then I realized Tim was the only one who seemed unaffected, sitting there with a smile, didn't quite reach his eyes. "How's it feel?" Tim suddenly said, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence. "You know, after everything, after all of you abandoned me, how does it feel now?" His words hit me like a punch in the gut. My heart started to race. I couldn't speak. I felt so weak, like my body was betraying me. I wasn't the only one. Everyone else was fading too. Nausea, dizziness, cold sweats. It felt like we were all slipping away one by one. Tim's grin widened as he watched us struggle. You should have thought about that before you left me behind. It doesn't feel so good now, does it? That's when I realized what was happening. The food. We'd all been eating the same things, and now we were all sick. Too sick to even stand up. Something was wrong, and the sinking feeling in my gut told me Tim was behind it. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. You'll all suffer for a bit, but you'll be fine. Just like me. Just like when all my friends turned their backs on me. I suffered for a while, abandoned and alone, but now I'm fine. Tim's voice was cold, almost mocking as he turned to leave. He gave us one last look, a satisfied smirk on his face, and walked out the door. By that point, we were almost completely incapacitated. Thank God Mark managed to grab the phone and dial 911 before collapsing. The ambulance arrived just in time. We were all rushed to the hospital, all of us struggling to stay conscious as we fought off the overwhelming nausea. We found out later that Tim had spiked some of the food and drinks with ipecac syrup, the stuff they use to induce vomiting in cases of poisoning, and some kind of sedatives. So we weren't just vomiting, we were losing control of our bodies, our systems shutting down from the toxic levels he had forced into us. We were lucky though. We all recovered. The doctor said it could have been much worse. The police went to Tim's apartment the next day, only to find it completely empty. It turns out, Tim hadn't even enrolled for the fall semester. He hadn't been a student for months. He had come back solely to exact his twisted revenge. When the police contacted his parents, they were just as shocked. They had no idea where he was. They thought he was enrolled in college, living life like normal. They had no idea about the plagiarism or the falling out or any of it. We don't know where Tim went after that. His trail went cold. But with Thanksgiving coming up again, I can't help but think about that night. It's a reminder of how things can change, how someone can go from a friend to a monster in the blink of an eye. Happy Thanksgiving, friends, and thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these allegedly true Thanksgiving horror stories, I'd be ever so thankful if you liked the video and subscribed to the channel. We'll see you next time with more Whispers from the Pines.